begin, we'll be moving to our first speaker. Excuse me. Ben Peterson, King County Noxious Weed Control Board, talking about identification and control of some common aquatic noxious weeds. Ben, sir, please.
Okay, hold on. I think that's it. All right, thank you very much, Jim. And actually, you won't need flippers, but probably knee boots and hip waders for this.
Ben, real quickly, we're seeing your control panel for some reason. Can you collapse it? Hit the little red arrow, that little red arrow on the go-to web. There we go, perfect.
That work? Now it's just a big giant picture of me.
It's working.
Hold on, let me.
We can see your slides, Ben. You're good.
Okay. I just saw a giant picture of me. Okay. So thank you very much, Jim. You won't need a snorkel or flippers, but probably hip waders and then knee boots for this talk. So I'm going to talk about aquatic weed control, mostly emergent aquatic weeds. And my background is in Western Washington, but I've tried to broaden the scope of this to encompass the whole state. So hopefully it works for everybody, and at least it's interesting if it's not totally applicable to you. Come on, next slide. Okay, so where are the plants? This is my talk outline. First, I'm going to talk about where the plants are in the environment. Then I'll talk about purple loosestrife, garden loosestrife, phragmites, yellow flag iris, and then I have time for questions at the end. So where do emergent aquatic plants live? So the plants I'm talking about are on lakeshore areas, wetlands, stream sides, ditches, landscape depressions, shallow areas, and standing water. So plants that are growing up out of standing water or sort of have their feet wet in muddy soil. I'm not going to talk about floating leaf weeds or submerged weeds. These are sort of the most common weeds that people end up dealing with in terms of natural lands management and irrigation ditch management. So real quick, I'm going to talk about the permits that are required for control of this plant. In terms of manual control methods, Department of Fish and Wildlife has an HPA permit, which helps regulate work that's done in standing water. So for instance, if you're going to control these iris here, using machinery or something, you would need to get an HPA permit. If the plants are sort of up in just muddy soil, then you would not need an HPA permit, but local critical areas ordinances and shoreline master programs and clearing and grading permits would probably apply. There's also a pamphlet HPA permit that might be applicable in your situation. So look into that or contact them if you have questions, or contact me and I can help put you in the right direction. In terms of herbicide control, I would assume most of you know about this already, but at least in Washington Department of Agriculture administers the pesticide applicators licenses. And for any of these weeds, you would probably need an aquatic endorsement because they'll be growing in wetter areas. And you would also need either a Washington State Department of Ecology aquatic noxious weed permit or your aquatic plant and algae permit. I would assume there's similar kinds of permits in Oregon and other places you might be working. And in terms of biocontrol, you'll want to coordinate with the WSU Extension Biocontrol Program. Jen Andreas there help you out, figure out what's going on. So the first plant, purple loosestrife. So purple loosestrife is a Class B noxious weed in Washington, locally abundant. And here's some of my work colleagues this summer busily working on the purple loosestrife. So purple loosestrife, its key characteristics are that it's a perennial, comes back from roots every year. Rhizomatous, so grows sideways from rhizomes, but also reproduces via seeds. Plant has this magenta flower. It's not quite purple, depending on the picture it's purple, but I think it's more magenta. is a very showy spike of a flower, but the flowers are really only visible July into September. So the rest of the year, especially in the spring, you'll see, if you know where to look, you'll find the vegetative part of the plant hiding in reed canary grass or something like that, but otherwise it's pretty hard to spot. Some distinguishing characteristics are, the main one besides the flowers are the square stem. You can sort of see here, pretty stiff, four-sided square stem. You might find plants from the year before growing out, or the dead plants from the year before out in the natural areas as well to help you find it. Usually four-sided, sometimes six-sided. Leaves grow in this lanceolate-shaped leaf with a smooth edge, and usually grows in whorls or pairs across from the stem. Plants can produce up to 2.5 million seeds per plant, so something to keep in mind, and reproduces via seed and plant fragments, so you don't want to let it seed. A few things that purple loosestrife looks like that you might confuse it with are the native plant spirea, Douglas spirea or hardhack. This grows out in wetlands, the same place where purple loosestrife will grow. When you look up close, the flowers look quite a bit different, little itty bitty pink flowers. But from a distance, if you're driving by a wetland, you might see a big clump of spirea flowering out there, and you might think it's purple loosestrife. Spirea also is a bit woodier, more of a shrub. So that's one way you can tell it apart. There's also the native plant fireweed. Fireweed sort of has serrate leaf edges. The flowers look a bit different when you look up close. Always has sort of these droopy pre-flower buds up on top. And fireweed has a pretty extensive root system too. And then finally, there's Watson's willow herb. It's another epilobium, although fireweed's not epilobium anymore. Anyway, Watson's willow herb, the native plant grows out almost in the same place as a purple loosestrife. And it has little pink bud flowers. Usually the flowers don't open up much more than this. But the main way you can tell it apart is sort of has like this finely serrate leaf edge. And also you can pull up Watson's willow herb easily with 2 fingers, has pretty shallow roots. Whereas purple loosestrife, it takes a bit more effort to pull it up. So purple loosestrife habitat, just like you would think, it grows really well in wetlands, stream sides, rivers, ditches. Can grow both in freshwater and brackish water. And for those of you near the saltwater areas, each plant can live up to be 20 years old. So keep that in mind in terms of your management strategy. Emergent, so I talked about that. The other main thing to know about is it requires partial to full sun. So you probably won't find it growing deep in the trees here, but open areas it'll thrive well. So you can use that sort of as a management strategy, is trying to shade it out. The plant's native to Europe and Asia, like a lot of these noxious weeds. It was introduced to the East Coast in the early 1800s and from ship ballast. That's what I've read. And then it spread across the U.S. I mean, it could have been spread as an ornamental as well, because it's nice and showy. And it's in most states in the U.S., including a big chunk of Canada, including a whole lot of Washington State. So, you know, Lincoln County, Garfield, Columbia counties, they're fortunate. Hopefully they don't have any actually. But elsewhere, there's at least some plants. Pretty wide distribution. So the impacts, like most plants, it replaces native beneficial plants. It displaces the native habitat for animals and birds, other animals. So they're not used to the plants. Larger plants aren't palatable to cattle. So if you have a pasture or wet pasture, cows will avoid the purple loosestrife plants, enabling them to grow even more, and degrade hay fields, and it can trap sediment and raise the water table. So in terms of control strategies, the most straightforward one is manual control, just digging up the plants, cutting the flower heads. If you're going to dig them up, you want to get all the roots from soft, mucky soil. Sometimes if it's like a soft, gravelly area, you can just reach in with your hands and stick your hands down into the roots and slowly pull up the whole plant. You can see Trish here has this plant that she dug up. Although you need to make sure and take care of all the plant fragments. So if this was dug up, cut the flowers, and if Trish just chucked this root ball onto the wet shore, this would surely regrow into another, regrow into more leafy plants and set seed. So you don't want that to happen. So you want to take all the plants with you. Importantly, you want to cut and bag the flower stalks. If that's sort of, you have the minimum amount of time, you want to cut and bag the flowers to keep it from producing the 2.5 million seeds per plant. Any flower plant material purple loosestrife in a landfill, don't compost it. And so mowing and cutting, these will temporarily stop seed production, but keep in mind that the plants live to be 20 years old, so they have a lot of energy stored in their roots, and it won't kill the plants outright. Covering with weed cloth won't cure mature plants, if you just put down a weed mat, but if you have a big area, a succinct area, you might try, a really heavy-duty weed cloth. That might work. Might be a strategy you want to try. But in terms of cutting the flower heads, that's one thing that we do in our program is if we have just the minimum amount of time, we'll go around a lake and survey the plants and cut the flower heads. In terms of digging, just want to show you this picture here. You can see how big the root system is for the plant. It takes a bit of effort. If you're lucky, the soil is sandy or gravelly. If the plant's growing out of like a rockery or some rocky area or really heavy clay, you'll probably have a harder time digging. But it's suitable for smaller infestations and does cause soil disturbance. In terms of chemical control or biocontrol, I'll talk about that in a minute. So chemical control, you'd want to use a systemic herbicide because it's a perennial the roots. You want to use an aquatic herbicide and surfactant. Follow the permits and labels. Ideally, you'd go through an area twice per year, maybe separated by a month or so in the summer, because that'll help you find all the plants that weren't quite flowering yet. So maybe you'll go in July and then go again in late August to make sure you find all the plants. And then when treating an area intermixed with native monocots like sedges or grasses or cattails, you want to use a selective herbicide. It's careful spot spraying is less soil disturbance and manual control. So in terms of chemical control, this is the last slide for that. It's sort of a table that I made. It's not, not the absolute information on everything, but this is sort of what we've come up with over the years. Glyphosate works pretty well. It's non-selective. Triclopyr TEA is often what we use midsummer. We'll go out, one person will have a backpack sprayer and another person will have a bag and clippers and a GPS. And one person will be finding the plants, clipping the flower head, recording a GPS point, while the other person will be spot spraying the plant after that. You're going to use triclopyr. You want to get thoroughly wet the plant to ensure it works well. If you just spray half the plant, it won't work quite so well. Other strategies are using a Mazapyr or Mazamox. These both work really well. They're non-selective, so you'll affect the plants around them as well. But they work well. They're slower acting, so ideally you'd want to go out when it's in the pre-flower stage or even before the flowering stage and spray the plants then. So that's a good strategy. The hard thing though is finding the plants. So you'll want to go out and use your GPS and find the plants where you knew they were last. Finally, talking about biocontrol for purple loosestrife. So biocontrol is the use of insects that are native to where the weed is native. These insects have been tested to make sure that they only predate on the target weed and no other native plants or agricultural plants that would be growing in the area. In this case, there's been a lot of work done around Galaricella beetles. They work really well in knocking back purple loosestrife populations. In this case, this is the Winchester Wasteway out near Moses Lake. Biocontrolled beetles, insects were released think around 25 years ago, and within a few years, they really got rid of the purple loosestrife. They really did a great job. I've heard that a lot of phragmites came back in its place, but they really knocked back the purple loosestrife. So one thing to note with biocontrol strategies is they won't actually eradicate the plants, but they'll sort of take the infestation from a really high level and drop it down to a much lower level and sort of keep it at a sort of steady state lower level once the insects get in sync with the plant population. So Gallop cell beetles are the most common ones of those, and then another one is the root-feeding Alobius weevils, and they both work in different ways, but contract the WSU biocontrol program to find out more and find out how you can get a hold of those. So they're suitable for really large and accessible populations where you don't foresee having the manpower to go in there and totally eradicate the plant anytime soon. All right, on to the next plant, garden loosestrife, Schmachia vulgaris, nice and yellow. But garden loosestrife is not actually related to purple loosestrife, even though they both have the loosestrife name. They're different genuses. Garden loosestrife is also a Class B noxious weed in Washington State. It grows about the same size as purple loosestrife, 2 to 10 feet tall. Usually it's in like the 5 foot tall range. Like purple loosestrife, it's native to Eurasia. The flowers are showy, yellow, primrose-like flowers. You can see them here. 5 petals, 5 sepals. And importantly, they grow sort of like in this terminal panicle. So they're clumped at the top of the stem. You can see it here, and that's one way you can differentiate from another plant that looks similar to it. So sort of these like sort of clumps of flowers at the end of the stem, not all along the stem. It flowers July to September, so just like purple loosestrife, you'll be out there and you'll see yellow and purple mixed in together. Well, hopefully you won't see either of them. Leaves are opposite or in whorls. They have this nice straight round stem, not like purple loosestrife, so this has a round stem. And if you look on the bottom, there's these little orange glands, but usually you can't see those. So another picture, there's a picture of the nice round stem up close with little soft hairs. And then occasionally it'll grow like in this really big, wide, fasciated stem growth pattern. These are like little flower buds that haven't bursted open yet. But almost always it's this round stem. And we don't know why it grows fasciated sometimes, but it looks sort of cool. One thing to know about garden loosestrife, it has these really long, stringy red rhizomes. It can go out up to 15 feet in the adjacent water and put down new roots. So it can really spread out in standing water. So the plant reproduces by the rhizomes. A little bit of rhizome as short as like 1 to 2 centimeters. If it has a node, can reproduce, according to research by Kelsey. And also the seeds are viable. So unlike some plants, the wetland plants, the seeds are also super viable, 82% viability. So you really want to account for the seeds and the roots. So what garden loosestrife isn't, went over purple loosestrife before. It's a different order and a different family. Purple loosestrife has a square stem, magenta flowers. And also garden loosestrife is not yellow loosestrife. This is Machia punctata. It's the same genus, but the stem looks about the same. Yellow loosestrife has these sort of star-shaped flowers, and they occur like all along the stem, unlike garden loosestrife that has a cluster of flowers at the tip top. So if you see an ornamental plant, a plant yellow flowered, you might think it's purple loosestrife or garden loosestrife. You can always take a picture of it and send it to me or Jennifer Parsons at Department of Ecology. We can help you identify it. So yeah, if you're not sure, check in about it, but yellow loosestrife, it's a non-native, non-invasive ornamental, usually. So garden loosestrife distribution, there's a good chunk in Western Washington, but also places in Northeastern Washington too. Looking at the big map here, it's not hugely widespread yet, and we hope to keep it that way. So if it does pop up in your county, contact the State Weed Board and work with other people you know. Contact me if you want advice, but do all you can to get rid of it and keep it from spreading, because you don't want to have it end up with a whole bunch of red dots all over the county like we have here in King County. So garden loosestrife impacts, like most plants, it displaces native plants, interferes with wetland food web, clogs small streams, can clog irrigation ditches, wet pastures, you know, the usual invasive wetland kind of plant. You could even displace other weeds. I've seen it displace blackberry and reed canary grass. So control, what doesn't work so well? So manual control is really only feasible for a really small area. Based upon how big the roots are and how much they spread laterally, it's really easy to break off roots and not get all the plant. So unless you know that it's just in a really tiny area, manual control really won't get rid of it. You know, cut the flowers, that's good if that's the minimum amount of time you have. But for this plant, even more so than purple loosestrife, you're going to want to do something that really gets to the roots one way or another. Repeated mowing may knock it back, but it'll start spreading laterally. And there's no biocontrol for this plant because, like you see on the previous slide here, it's not terribly widespread. So there just hasn't been the resources to put into it. So one thing that's worked on a small scale is tarping. Did this at an organic farm a few years ago, and it worked pretty well. Used heavy-duty tarps, gotten from the hardware store, put down rocks and logs, stake down the corner really well, leave it up for a year or two. If you do this kind of thing, you'll definitely want to check the tarp condition a few times a year. So put it on your calendar, budget the time to do that, because it can go through rips in the tarp that can occur. And you know, the tarps degrade over time, they get weaker. So, and then also, you know, you can see plants coming out from the side here. I think this is one right here coming out. So, but it worked well in a really dense patch. In terms of chemical control, whatever you use, it needs to be systemic to get at those rhizomes that are in the soil, and it grows, you know, really aggressively in wet clay soils. Needs to be an Aquatic approved herbicide, of course. And so we've tried many over the years. Triclopyr seems to act too fast on the plants. The plants will definitely return just as robust as before. Places that we, you know, have had triclopyr sprayed, the plants will come back and flower just the same the next year. But it's suitable for a place, you know, it's selective, you know, so you can use it around cattails and other grasses and stuff. Glyphosate doesn't work that well, at least on its own. We've had the best luck with the imazapyr or imazamox. Imazapyr works pretty well. The next year, the growth will be stunted. Usually it won't flower the next year. Often you'll still have some plant come back, but it'll be a lot more stunted and you'll really reduce the impact of it. One drawback with imazapyr is the off-target damage. You know, if there's a garden loosestrife plant growing right next to a willow, you'll probably affect the willow if you spray them. Imazamox works similar to imazapyr chemically, but possibly less off-target damage. And sometimes you combine imazamox with glyphosate. And here's the overall recommendation for garden loosestrife treatments. There's still nothing perfect. It's not like you know, some plants that you know you'll be able to kill it with this one treatment. Unfortunately, we haven't come across that yet. So if you have any ideas, please let me know. Very small areas, you know, try digging. Larger areas, you know, tarping maybe, if you can afford the time and resources to do that. The default, usually what we do is 1% imazapyr in the late summer. Early summer is really good too if you know where the plants are. The hard thing is finding the plants. You can see in this picture here, the plants, the green part of the plant just mixes in with the other native, or maybe not native, the reed canary grass that's growing there. So you need to know just where to look. We've also used 3 to 4% imazamox with or without 1% glyphosate, and that worked well too. We'll knock the plants back. You want to cut the flowers before spraying. if at all possible, to reduce harm to any pollinators. One thing that Tim Miller found worked well was aminopyrrolid in sites where it's allowed. You know, you could probably technically spray aminopyrrolid at this site if you have the permit, but you would not be able to expect any native plants to come back because aminopyrrolid is so long-acting and also affects woody trees. So the Department of Ecology permit is very specific about when aminopyrrolid can be used. So definitely heed those rules. But if it's suitable for your site, definitely give it a try because that might work the best. Keep good GPS data about where the plants are, and persistence is important. Go back annually and don't let it go to seed. All right, on to Phragmites. Phragmites australis, subspecies australis. Common reed, another Class B weed in Washington State. It's important that you target the subspecies australis, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but it has a unfortunate common name. It's very generic, it's just called common reed. So usually we call it Phragmites, but as long as you know what you're working on, it doesn't matter what you call it, I guess. Class B weed, it grows at least 12 feet tall sometimes. You can see a picture of Karen here. She's actual size. So you can see the plants up there, good 6 or 7 feet taller than Karen. Has wide, stiff leaves, sort of poking up here. They're not too droopy. A lot wider than reed canary grass. Leaves are 1 to at least 1.5 inches wide. Has this sort of large, feathery flower head. You can see it's sort of like a plume, almost like a Jubata grass, kind of. But yeah, this big plume of a flower head. Thick woody rhizomes, grow to 6 feet deep, so nice woody roots. 6 feet deep, so that's something to keep in mind when you're trying to control it. And it spreads mostly by rhizome, not so much by seed. I mean, it does produce seed, but the main way it reproduces by rhizome. You can see it here going across the water. Sneaky. So there's a native subspecies. The subspecies named americanus is native to North America, but it's not as common as the weedy one. And here's a way to tell a few of them apart. The native in general has fewer leaves, lighter colored leaves, sparser growth, and less bushy flowers compared to the invasive, which is more leaves, darker leaves, denser growth, and bushier flowers. Although you're probably not going to have like a stand of each one next to each other, so you can compare side by side with this, perfect situation. So there's other ways you can tell them apart. The leaf collar of the native has like a little bit of purple around it, and there's maybe a like thin vein on the back, but nothing pronounced. Whereas the invasive will have a white collar and sort of a thicker white vein down the middle of the back of the leaf collar. You can also look at the stem color. This is a little arbitrary. The invasive one is lighter in stem color, usually thicker stems, whereas the native is darker in stem color. Sort of hard to tell. One more thing is the stem color. The invasive one has sort of beige to green stems, and the native one has like sort of red tinged stems. So you sort of see sort of the red tinge on the stem or on the leaf color, then you might be dealing with the native one. So get it checked out before you go out and kill a bunch of it. And then there's a few more other plants you want to make sure you're not mixing it up with. Reed canary grass. Usually, reed canary grass only grows 6 feet tall, whereas Phragmites grows 12 feet tall, and they have really different looking flowers. But when they're small, it's hard to tell them apart. So when they're small, new growth, especially places where you've sprayed Phragmites the year before, Phragmites will have this little hairy fringed ligule collar. Whereas reed canary grass will have this papery ligule. You can see it right here. Sort of papery ligule sticks up maybe like a 1/4 inch compared to this sort of really delicate sort of fringed ligule on Phragmites. And then finally, comparing Phragmites to arundo or giant reed, Arundo donax. I don't think there's much of it in Washington State, maybe none at all, but hopefully not much. It grows even bigger than Phragmites. It grows to be 18 feet tall in some situations, or maybe taller. Arundo has really wide leaves, 2 to 3 inches wide, compared to Phragmites, which are about 1.5 inches wide at the most. So that's one way you can tell it apart. Also, just the overall size of the patch. If you see like Phragmites, it's even, 20 feet tall, then it might be Arundo. All right. So you can see where it's found. It's wetland ditches, depressions in both disturbed areas and undisturbed areas. So Phragmites can really creep into undisturbed areas, such as probably what happened in the Winchester Wasteway. It doesn't need to be a disturbed site for this plant to really invade and take over a wetland. It's probably what happened here. I can't imagine that this wetland near Seattle was all that disturbed before Phragmites took over. And it can, form dense monotypic stands, displaces native wildlife plants and plants, impedes water flow, and I've read that it may increase the frequency of winter marsh fires. All right, so on this page, there's a celebrity sighting. So see if you can find the celebrity on this page. There it is, Chevy Celebrity. Anyway, next. Common reed. So anyway, this is a map of the non-native genotypes. So the Phragmites australis. So there's a lot scattered around the Columbia Basin, places in Western Washington. There's likely more places than have been mapped. Our county program is fortunate that we have a lot of resources to seek things out and keep track of them, but there's probably more places around in Western Washington where it occurs, and maybe Eastern Washington too. You can see from the EdMaps map that it's pretty widespread throughout the US. So small areas, really small areas, you can try to dig. If it's just one little patch where it's new plants that are showing up, you can try digging them out. That's what Maria is working on here. But keep in mind that they have this big root system that goes down up to 6 feet deep. So it might not be worth it, especially if it's even just a few-year-old patch. It might have pretty big roots. So in places where herbicide is not an option, your best bet is to cut the plants back. And usually it'll be a big dense stand. So the best time to cut is at tassel stage, and this is sort of a picture of tassel stage. It's basically when it's flowering. You see these flower heads before it's seed set stage. The tassel stage, late July, early August. Usually, the seeds are sort of more viable like the end of August into September. It takes a while for the seeds to get formed. So you'd want to cut it at tassel stage, and that's when most of the energy from the plant is above the ground. If you cut it at any other time of the year, it increases the plant vigor, so it'll just make it mad. So that'll be your best bet to sort of sever some of that energy. But it'll still come back somewhat, but at least you'll knock it back and you'll be able to deal with the situation a little bit better. In terms of herbicide control strategies, you want to use something systemic because that's a big root system, Aquatic approved, and something that's non-selective, because it grows, or because it's a monocot. Triclopyr won't work. So we found the best results with imazapyr, usually 1% imazapyr or 2% glyphosate. But imazapyr works really well in places where you can not too worry about too much about affecting the other plants in the area. You want to use a good surfactant, and I always use dye, especially when I spray Phragmites, because you're sort of up in there and walking through it, and you don't want to walk through something you just sprayed. If possible, you'd want to spray in August or September. That's the best time of year to spray. If possible, you want to mow or cut the stalks at least 2 weeks after spraying or later into the fall or winter. This will make it so you can see the new plants coming up after the spraying. The next year better. Otherwise, you can see in this situation here where I'm out here spraying, and there's all these dead stalks from the year before. Just makes it a little hard to get around and hard to find the new plants. And here's like 1, 2, 3 plants that came back from after spraying this big patch. So you get pretty good results. But like anything, you want to follow up over the years. So last plant, yellow flag iris, class C, noxious weed. So this is a bit more widespread even than purple loosestrife and garden loosestrife. It's common pretty much throughout the state. So yellow flag iris, the key characteristic is the yellow flower. It's the only, there are no native irises that have a yellow flower. So if you're out in a natural setting, you see some iris growing out in the wildlands, you're worried if it's a native iris or not. And if it's yellow, it's not a native iris. That's when we could tell it apart. It's a monocot, so you need to know that in terms of control strategy. It has a thick rhizome and it forms solid mats, so it has, a really big root system. Of course, the yellow flowers and these green seed pods that sort of look like corn kernels. I have more pictures of that. Those seeds float. So in terms of identification, telling it apart from cattail, the best identifier is the midrib. You can sort of see in this profile picture, the iris has this prominent midrib. You can see it a little bit in this picture here, but you can always really feel it too. Even on the little tiny leaves, you can feel the midrib. Compared to cattail, which is a lot more crescent moon in cross section and pithy, a lot easier to squish. But yeah, cattail leaf is crescent moon in cross section, and iris are really flat and a little stiffer to squish. Yeah, like I said, about 5 feet tall. The flowers, your flowers usually April into June, sometimes into July, maybe not, maybe more starting in May. But yeah, definitely May to June. Here's a picture of the seeds, sort of like banana-like seed pods. These are about 4 inches long, and all these little floating seeds. And then here's a picture of the rhizome, just one part of it. It's been all cleaned off. Usually they're like, it's sort of like muddy corn cobs. Here's a picture of the rhizome. You can see all that starchy energy that it stores in the roots. There's another picture of the seeds. You can see them floating here. This is a picture I took 2 weeks ago. There's just a whole bunch of them floating around this wetland where we were spraying iris. You can see in this picture here, you can see sort of the prominent midrib. And I think all the info is the same as the previous slide, but yeah, the midrib is the big way to tell it apart if you're not sure. So impacts, it can really take over wetlands. It displaces native plants, reduces wildlife habitat. They can cause flooding. You can imagine this water would be harder to move through this wetland when it's full of iris. And can clog ditches, things like that. And it's also toxic eaten, so it's toxic to livestock. So distribution of the plant around the state, it's pretty widespread. You can see just all the counties. Again, way over in southeastern Washington, apparently there's some counties that don't have much of it, so that's great. They're doing a good job. You can see on this map here, there's just a lot of it, both in the east, Midwest, and West Coast. Probably out here, it's a lot of like in irrigation ditches and in ponds and things like that. But yeah, pretty common. So that's why it's a class C weed. So control. Your biggest priority is to bedhead, cut off the flowers to prevent seed production. You don't want a big mess of floating seed like this here. You want to do that, cut the flowers off in May or so, May to June, anytime before the seeds are out there. If you do that, be sure and wear gloves, because of the sap can cause an allergic reaction. If you're going to dig them out, if it's a small enough patch, you can try digging out the rhizomes, but know that it's just a lot of stuff to dig out. Here's an example of a small little vegetative plant, and it has a pretty big root system just for that small plant. And if you don't get it all, you might promote growth of the more plant. You sort of dividing up the rhizome, like people divide up bulbs. So make sure you can get it all. Mowing or cutting repeatedly for several years may weaken the plant because you won't be able to, the plant will be able to photosynthesize and send energy down to its roots, but the plants will probably still persist. One strategy that works, that I've read that works pretty well, is if you can cut emergent plants that are growing up out of the water, below the water line. When you do that repeatedly, cut all the stems below, a few inches below the water line, and that'll gradually flood the roots, the rhizomes. One situation or one strategy that can be used in places where you're not going to spray smaller areas are tarping. They do this up in BC often because they have different herbicide regulations. So they use this thick PVC pond liner. What you want to do is cut the plants in the spring down to the roots, and then put this thick pond liner out there. Don't stake it down. Use rocks and logs and stuff that are really heavy to stake it down, hold it down. You're going to want to keep it there for at least 4 months, up to 12 months. I would do it at least 12 months because if you're putting through the effort to put the pond liner out there, keep it out there a long time. And this will gradually kill the roots. It'll keep them from getting oxygen, and also they can't release toxic gases. So that's a good way to do it. Takes a lot of time and effort, but it works in smaller areas. So something to consider. And then it also makes it so you can plant right back into the area with native species once the iris is dead. So in terms of herbicide control, we found that, or not we, there was a study done about 10 years ago with WSDA and Department of Ecology where they studied control methods in terms of chemical control, among other things. And they found that fall herbicide application is best, seconded by spring or early summer. So if you're just going to apply herbicide once, fall is the best because the herbicide will get translocated down to the roots as the plant is storing energy for the winter. You'll want to use non-selective herbicides. So sometimes people use like probably 5% glyphosate, but that works pretty well. We found that imazamox or imazapyr works even better. Probably 3% imazamox. That's what I've been using. And you might even consider doing a higher rate than normal of your aquatic surfactant because the leaf is really waxy and there's not much surface area. So you might want to do a bit higher rate surfactant than you normally would with the aquatic surfactant. So either 3% imazamox or 1.5% imazapyr. And then the last thing that sometimes people use for a really targeted approach is this wick wiper. So basically he has some kitchen tongs with sponges on it, and he'll squirt 25% herbicide solution on the sponges and wipe up. And that'll be can be a really targeted way to get to the plant without affecting the surrounding vegetation so much. So with all these situations, because iris can grow in really dense areas, dense clones, you want to make sure you don't go over the herbicide label rate or how much herbicide you're putting out per acre per year. So keep track of that, especially if you're using, like 3% imazamox, you can start to add up. I think that is about it. One more slide of iris, and then I think I'll be ready for questions if you need them. So persistence pays off. First, you want to remove the seed heads, ideally in the spring, and that'll also help you get a sense of how dense the area is, help you map the infestation. Smaller areas, dig it carefully or tarp, and then larger areas, the herbicide in the fall is best, but late spring is good too. So if you have any questions, there's my contact info, questions after the fact. And if you have questions now, you can go for that too. Stop sharing the screen.
And yes, sir, we do have some questions that have been typed in.
Okay.
So first one was, how can we feel confident about biological controls not becoming a noxious weed problem or noxious SP problem?
Oh, how can we be confident biocontrol releases won't become a problem for the environment in general? So biocontrol, I mean, I would look up the WSU extension website. But biocontrol insects are studied extensively by US Department of Agriculture and authorities in Europe to make sure that the insects only target the target plant. They don't affect any native plants, and they don't affect any horticultural plants or agricultural plants. So they won't allow them to be used as a biocontrol if that is the case. If that answers the question.
Thank you. And another one was how to stop nurseries from selling noxious weeds. I got a yellow loosestrife via nursery as a gift and flagged it.
Oh, that's a good question. So the nursery trade is regulated by the State Department of Agriculture. They have a plant quarantine list. And pretty much all the aquatic noxious weeds are on the plant quarantine list, and many of the terrestrial noxious weeds, but not all, are on the plant quarantine list. And so this list are plants that the nursery trade is not allowed to, sell or distribute. Although there are plants, such as yellow loosestrife, which is related to garden loosestrife and grows in a similar place, that are allowed to be sold. There's also like cultivars of plants, such as certain cultivars of butterfly bush that are allowed to be sold. But it's separate, sort of a parallel list from the state noxious weed list. So in terms of working to get more plants on that list, I would assume WSDA would be the people to talk to, and they communicate with the state weed board, but they have a little bit different priority. Their focus is horticulture, not I guess open space management.
Thank you. And another one, when would one use lamazamox? I could be pronouncing that wrong.
Oh, imazamox?
Yeah.
So imazamox compared to imazapyr, they're related chemically. I think it's still on patent by the first company that made it, where compared to imazapyr, which is more widely available and a little cheaper. Supposedly imazamox has less off-target damage. You're less likely, it hangs around in the environment not as long. Usually I use imazamox in places where I really want to make sure I kill the garden loosestrife as much as possible, but I want to be more careful around native plantings, willows, trees, things like that. Usually I end up using about double the rate of imazamox that I would imazapyr. That's also slower acting, so you may spray plants with imazamox and not really see much results. It may take 6 weeks before you really see the plants dying off, and you notice it more the following year. So it's a similar plant, similar herbicide you can use in aquatic situations.
Okay, and the last one I think we'll have time for is Watson's willow herb similar to the noxious weed hairy willow herb? How common is Watson's?
That's a good question. Watson's willow herb is native, but I think they're both, I'm sure they're both epilobium. Watson's willow herb, it's pretty common in the Seattle area, the Western Washington. I see it around in wetlands a lot, sometimes in more disturbed areas, but it's a native plant. Whereas hairy willow herb, there's only a few places in King County where it grows. There's a big patch up in Whidbey Island where it grows. Hairy willow herb, I think it grows a lot bigger. It has a much bigger root system than Watson's willow herb. Than Watson's willow herb. Get it mixed up. So I hope that helps. But yeah, look up hairy willow herb on the State Weed Board website or the King County website, and you can find out more info.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Thanks.